Hey guys, how you doing? So, unless you've been living in a cave for the last 3+ years, you know at least something about the massive number of irregularities the nation witnessed during the 2020 presidential election, especially in the key battleground states where Democrat county workers simultaneously decided that for the first time in our history, they were all going to shut down the counting of the votes and begin again in the morning. But we have multiple witnesses who say that in each of those states in question, the counting of the votes never really stopped throughout the night. In fact, the only time they did stop counting votes was until there were Republican observers left the building and went home. That's why millions of Americans went to bed that night feeling pretty good that Donald Trump was crushing it ahead of Joe Biden, only to be told the next morning that overnight that Biden took the lead somehow. What happened to shutting down the counting of the votes until the morning? And how come no one has ever answered that question? Trump voters were then treated like prisoners of war, losing all of their First Amendment rights when it came to asking questions or getting the answers they demanded. One of the key battleground states where election irregularities have become obvious since the 2020 election is Georgia. Some recognize Georgia as a state with serious residency problems on the voter rolls that can lead to election fraud voting. Over the years, some have tried to fix the system to make elections more secure. People want to know what exactly went on in Georgia during the 2020 election and what is the real story behind Trump's now infamous phone call with Georgia's Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. And at the center of all of that is the RICO case against President Trump. Fani Willis is the DA who is charging Trump with a RICO violation for trying to prove that there were people who voted illegally. These questions and more are still not answered. What should we make of it? And what does it tell you about the people who are running elections in the state of Georgia? I thought there was no one better to ask these questions than Mark Davis, a Georgia native. Mark is the president of Data Productions Incorporated. He's a data guy. He's been working with Georgia voter data since 1986. In fact, 5 courts have deemed him an expert witness on elections and redistricting issues, and he joins us now. Hi, Mark. How you doing? You're there, Mark.
Rich, you there?
Yeah. How you doing, Mark?
All right. How are you?
I'm good, man. So I got a couple questions before we start. Number one, residency issues. Why does it matter, even in a presidential election, when the election is nationwide? And the second one is, what does it take to overturn an election in Georgia?
What a great place to start. A lot of people misunderstand these issues, so it's a really good idea to clear them up from the get-go. When we go to vote for president, that's not the only race on the ballot. We've got all kind of other races on the ballot, and our ballots are determined by our location. Sometimes even the precinct we vote in can be split between 2 different districts.
Right.
So that's why we have residency laws. And in Georgia, we have to vote in the county and the municipality where we actually live, except for the 30-day grace period right before an election. So if we moved right before an election, then we can vote where we're still registered. But outside of that 30-day grace period, the law requires that we vote where we live so that we're voting in the right races. So that's the first thing to understand. It is a violation of state law, OCGA 21-2-562, to knowingly lie about our residency when we go to vote. It's also a violation of the Prohibited Acts section of the Voting Rights Act if there's a federal race on the ballot, any federal race, including.
So there you go. You're back. Go ahead.
So it's important to understand that no matter what the election is, we're supposed to be voting where we live. What was your other question again?
The other question was, what does it take to actually overturn an election in Georgia?
Okay, so the Georgia Supreme Court recognizes 2 different paradigms under which an election can be overturned. And this is a decade.
Oh, wow.
Recently requoted in their decision in Smith versus Odom. If you look at page 15 of that that decision. Paradigm number one and paradigm number two. Paradigm number one is when you go vote by vote by vote. So let's say candidate A gets beat by, or candidate A beats candidate.
Oh, wow. We're having issues
Want
here.
to challenge the election. And they file a complaint and they say 15 of those votes were illegal. So the burden then falls on candidate B to prove that. And so if it goes to court, he's going to go through all 15 votes that he thinks were illegal. And let's say the judge agrees with him on 12. Well, 12 is still greater than 10. So the plaintiff should prevail. The other way, though, an election that, quote, cannot be measured in the same discrete manner as under paradigm number one. That's the one that is basically the definition, as far as I'm concerned, for the term systemic irregularities. So those are the two ways. And people misunderstand that it doesn't have anything to do with who would have voted for Biden or who would have voted for Trump, or trying to figure out which candidate had the illegal votes and try to
Yeah, you can't tell that anyway in Georgia.
The votes are straight up legal or illegal, straight up irregular or irregular.
Right.
And
well, let's go and start off with you explaining how you got involved in doing an analysis on the 2020 voter data and how you got it to the Trump legal team.
You seem to have frozen. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I know there's a problem with the line here. You were frozen a couple times. Sorry about that, folks.
That's all right. I think it's the internet here, but so I got involved with working with voter data in 1986, and because I've been working with it forever, I've always noticed problems with it. And after Motor Voters started in 1993, I was able.
You're frozen again.
So I took an interest a long time ago in election integrity, because I figured if somebody like me who works with the voter data all the time doesn't do it, who's going to? So I went before the state election board back in 2002 to talk about the issues that I'm going to talk with you about again today.
Yeah.
So I've been trying for a long time to rectify a lot of this stuff. But I got involved in being an expert witness in some of these court cases because basically the party asked me to. The first
we got to do something about the internet.
Time, and a third time, and a fourth time, and a fifth time. So after the 2020 election, about the election, and I started to run some of the analysis that I do in some of these cases that I've testified in. There's sort of a standard set of analyses that I do. And I started running through those. And one of the first ones I ran was looking at residency issues. And I was shocked. I was shocked to find huge amounts of residency issues. There were about 580,000 people when I ran national change of address processing from the Postal Service. I'm a licensee. I can
Oh, wow.
The license that I have, I don't use but half that ordinarily. So I'd plenty.
Oh, wow. We're getting real latency here.
Oh, really?
Yeah. You're freezing up a bit. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, we'll just power through it. What's up, Commander? Right.
So anyway, there were about 580,000 people who had filed changes of address. Over 270,000 said they were moving out of the state. About 314,000 said they were moving within the state. Of the 314, one county to a new county, but had not updated their voter registration.
Right.
Because if they've moved more than the 30-day grace period from the election, then they have lost their residency in their old county. And if they're not registered in their new county, They don't have anywhere to vote. And the Secretary of State's website, you can see this in that article in the Federalist that sort of started all of this. He used to have language on there explaining this very clearly, but we'll come back to that.
All right.
So anyway, of the 110,000 people, the vast majority of them, about 75,000 or so, did not attempt to vote unlawfully in their old county. But the data indicates that as many as 35,000 did go vote in their old county. Now, if they moved temporarily, that's lawful. But if they move permanently, and the vast majority of these will have moved permanently, then it's not lawful. And so when I found that, obviously it was a concern, and in fairly short order, within days of finding this, I turned a copy of that data over to the Trump lawyers so that they could be working on the situation from their end. But then the next thing that was obvious was we had that Senate runoff coming up. And so we had to turn our attention to that. And at this point in the story, I want to mention Derek Somerville. I kind of partnered with him on doing challenges for the U.S. Senate runoff.
Is that the former FBI guy?
Yeah, the reason I did that is because what I saw was just mind-boggling to me, and I wanted him to poke holes in it. I said, Derek, would you please put your FBI hat on and take a look at this data and do your best to disprove it? I said, I'd rather get corrected in private than, embarrassed in public. So, he started going through it, taking random samples and running people down and checking it out. And the more he looked at it, the more convinced he was that it was spot on. And so we decided that nothing the Secretary of State could do. There was nothing the state election board could do. The only people that were in a position to do anything about it at that point was the county boards of elections. So we started to organize challenges for people to file in their counties. And at the same time, True the Vote was also creating challenges. Now, their challenges were a lot broader than ours. Ours were narrowly focused on people who had already arguably cast a ballot with residency issues in the general election, and we sought to prevent them from doing the same in the Senate.
Do me a favor before you go on. Get into explaining why it's important that the law says that if you move from one county to another and you have not notified the state that you have moved X amount of days before the election, why you can't vote in either election. And these people did vote. Get into what's the importance of it? Like, why is it important that you have to be registered in your new county? Because who do you vote for in the counties?
Yeah, well, you're voting for your county sheriff and your district attorney, and you're voting.
Absolutely. You broke up again.
So it's very important that people vote based on where they live.
Right. And so what you're saying then is that there was a number of people who notified the post office that they were moving prior to the election, but they never re-registered, and that is against the law. And so what we're saying is I'm not saying that Trump won, and Biden lost or anything like that, but what I am saying is that you had found a number of votes that could have been rendered null because of that law, right?
Well, these voters should not have been permitted to cast ballots unless they voted provisionally. In the past, right, when these voters were identified, they'd be offered a provisional ballot. Stacy Abrams actually asked a judge in 2018 to count several thousand of those ballots in the governor's race, and her argument was that since it was a statewide race, they should be counted. And the judge didn't buy into that argument and ruled against
law
her.
is the law. Yeah.
So
Go ahead.
I think without question, these votes are not lawfully cast. In fact, the state election board has referred cases like this to the attorney general's office in the past to be prosecuted. So anyway, yeah, you can't do that. And when we found all of those votes, I let the Trump attorneys know about it, and then we turned our attention to the Senate runoff. And Derek and I started preparing challenges for people to file. And almost immediately, we were served with a lawsuit from Mark Elias, who represented Fair Fight, Stacy Abrams Fair Fight organization. And we were accused of attempting to intimidate voters. They equated challenging a voter under a lawful statute here in Georgia, right. OCGA 21-2-230. That statute codifies our right to challenge a fellow voter in the county that we live in as part of our First Amendment rights to petition our county government for redress of grievances.
Right. Let me interrupt for a second. Mark Elias, guys, is the guy who in 2020, prior to 2020, he had teams of lawyers out there suing in states across the country to change election laws so that they favored the Democrats. Okay. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution says that state legislatures have the authority to create and change laws, election laws. And Mark Elias just put out a tweet the other day. I should have put it up here. He put out a tweet the other day bragging that he was doing it again. So he goes into a court, into a state court, and argues against election laws, hoping that a Democrat activist judge is going to find in his favor. And boom, now you've got election laws changed by the judiciary and by a lawyer and not the state legislature. I'm sorry, Mark, go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I think he clearly had two goals here. Number one, I think, is to intimidate.
Oh, yeah.
Let's face it. I found myself staring at a 6 or 7 figure legal bill just to fight that case. And
the process is the punishment.
True the Vote had our backs. They provided our legal defense. If they hadn't, I'd have been
out a whole lot.
But his second goal is to set precedent. If he can set the precedent that challenging voters with residency issues equates to voter intimidation, which is a huge leap, obviously.
Right.
But if he could set that precedent, then he could thwart challenges in the future.
Yeah, everybody would be afraid. It would be the old, if you try to challenge what we did in this election, this is what's going to happen to you. This is what they're doing to Trump. But go ahead. And his lawyers, as a matter of fact.
Well, as Molly Hemingway puts it, the process is the punishment. And that's what this was all about, is putting us through hell for 3 solid years.
Drag your name.
We had an Obama-appointed judge, and I was a bit nervous about that. But he turned out to be fair-minded, and the ruling he wound up issuing was that none of the co-defendants in the case had intimidated voters. There was no evidence of it.
Right.
It was a very clear-cut win for us and a very clear-cut loss for Elias. And it really puts him in a bind here, because if he appeals it to the 11th Circuit and loses, I mean, this case as it is set precedent. But if he goes to the 11th and loses, it sets binding precedent.
Yep.
So he's only got a couple more weeks to make that decision. And, usually when an organization loses, they rush out on the courthouse steps and tell the media that are waiting, we will immediately appeal.
Right. He's not going to do that, Mark. And we both know why, because it was a bogus, frivolous suit to begin with.
Yeah.
He dragged your name through the mud for 3 long years.
They compared us to the Klan. They claimed we were trying to suppress the votes of Black and brown people. I mean, all of this nonsense.
Yeah. Well, that's what they do. It's what Stacy Abrams.
Us, nor True the Vote, or any of the people that volunteered to help with the effort. Nobody talked to a single voter. Those voters in the courtroom, they couldn't point out any of us. They knew the name True the Vote, but they didn't know who was True the Vote. They didn't point at Catherine or Greg or any of those people.
Right.
They didn't know the rest of us, didn't even know our names. And so it was ludicrous. And at trial, they just utterly failed to be able to show a single voter that was legitimately intimidated.
I think what they did was
My
what Democrats.
residency, I'm not intimidated. I'll just show them what they
Oh
need
yeah,
to see.
I think what they did is what a lot of Democrats do, is they drug you through the mud, knowing that the possibilities were high they were going to lose, but they did it just to keep the whole thing in the news. You know, they wanted to trash Trump, and you guys went and, according to them, you helped Trump, so they have to trash you. But they wanted to keep the whole anti-Trump thing in Georgia in the news. And that way, when they drag you guys around for 3 years, every now and then the news could come up with a little bite story and it freshened people's minds. They
Well,
do things like this.
not just that, but look how much money they raised off this.
Oh yeah, that's the other thing, the fundraising from it. Sure.
Yeah, they raised a heck of a lot of money off of this by getting out there talking about how they were going after us and
Yeah.
vilifying us and all of this. It was really disgusting what they did. And
Let's okay. You want to go chronologically, and I don't know if you're up to this point yet, but I
Yeah.
really want you to talk about Brad Raffensperger, from beginning to end, what he did, which
Okay.
I think is unconscionable. Go ahead.
So after we found the residency issues in the general election, word kind of got around, and the Secretary of State's office reached out to Derek asking for a copy of the data. The problem that I had with that was, whenever I testified in a court case, I've always been working off of a certified copy of the qualified list of electors. And I had put in an open records request with the Secretary of State's office for a certified copy of that data. And I wasn't seeing it. And I kept telling them, we're happy to turn the data over to you, but we want to do it off the certified copy of the file, because if this goes to court, that's really what I need to be testifying based on. And they continued to not comply. And when they finally did comply with that open records request, I got a heap of garbage. I got a voter database from them that was just mind-boggling. The file at the time had 62 fields in it, I think, something like that. And most of those fields were either missing or there was nonsense fields added. There was key stuff that was gone, like the voters' county and their voting districts and all this stuff. It was trash, complete trash.
They just sent it to you to say they sent you something. That's what it sounds like.
They maintain to this day that they complied with my open records request. Yeah. So anyway, we went round and round and round with them. But what I did was I waited to give them the data to investigate until I had begun to collect corroborating evidence. Because what happened was, these voters that had moved before the election started coming in after the election and finally getting around to updating their driver's licenses and their voter registration to the same exact addresses that they had told the post office they were moving to long before the election. So basically what they were doing is they were providing corroborating evidence on their change of address. They basically were proving that they did in fact move exactly where they told the post office they were going to move. So if that's true, then why would we doubt the when? Because when you move, you give a move effective date, and their move effective dates were before the election, not after. So anyway, so I handed that over to the Secretary of State's office for an investigation that they had already agreed to open in May of 2021. And around that time, the Federalist started doing some stories on this. I had interviewed with Molly Hemingway for her book Rigged, and we had spent a lot of time talking about this stuff. And she involved one of their reporters, Margot Cleveland, and Margot started writing some stories about it. And Channel 2 Action News here in Atlanta, after one of those stories, they filed an open records request with the Secretary of State's office, and they got hold of the data, and they went out to interview some voters, and both of the voters that they interviewed had moved and had gone and voted in their old counties. And like I said in the story, I felt kind of bad that they got put on the spot, but part of me wished they had interviewed 100. So anyway, after that happened, apparently factcheck.org took an interest, and I didn't find out about this for quite a while, but apparently they contacted the Secretary of State's office at some point asking for their opinion on these issues. And so like I said, I didn't find out about it then, but down the road, I got contacted by the attorneys representing us in the Fair Fight versus True the Vote case, and they said, Mark, what do you make of Exhibit 61? I'm like, I don't know, what is Exhibit 61? And they sent it to me. I had never seen it before. It was an email crafted for factcheck.org. If you go to the story in the Federalist, that Exhibit 61 is actually embedded in the story. You can read it for yourself. But he made two main arguments in there. One was that because of the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, we have to allow voters to vote where they're registered, even if they have issues with their residency, apparently. Because he also quoted from our own state law, OCGA 21-2-224, and this is the attorney for the Secretary of State writing this. He quoted from that law, which does say once you go on the qualified list of electors, you have to be permitted to cast your ballot.
Right.
Unless the voter has since become disqualified. Well, those are the voters we're talking about here. These are voters who have lost their residency in that county.
Right.
They have become disqualified because they're no longer qualified to vote in that county. And if anybody wants to research this, our residency laws can be found in OCGA 21-2-216, 217, and 218. All three are clear on this. So it just blew me away that he had gone to that length to bend and twist federal and state law into a pretzel.
Yeah.
Because even if you argue that the NVRA says what he claimed it says, and it doesn't.
It doesn't. Yeah.
The Voting Rights Act says just the opposite. If you go to the Prohibited Acts section, it says you can't lie about your residency with a federal race on the ballot. That includes president. That includes U.S. Senate.
Why do you think his office did it?
They don't want to deal with this because now we can get to that phone call with President Trump. Okay. The thing to understand about that is I had given them a copy of this data so far in advance of that phone call. They even had time to give it to an auditor in New York to review. I mean, They had it for quite some time. So going into that phone call, they all were very keenly aware of this issue. And this was a major issue. They had others. They had a lot of other issues from other analysts that they wanted to talk about too. But this was one of the major ones. And if you go down in the transcript to when Kurt Hebert starts talking, this is when they start getting into these issues. And when you hear this talk about an auditor and all of that it was the guy who looked into this data. So it's clear to me that Trump was basically speaking in shorthand, as he likes to do.
He does all the time.
He knew he was talking to a bunch of people who all had the same understanding of the law. And here in Georgia, if the number of votes that are illegal or irregular exceed the margin, then a judge can and should throw that election out, or set it aside is what the law actually says. And then what? We're all on the same page about what it takes to overturn an election in Georgia.
But what would happen, Mark, if a judge did set it aside, the election? What would happen after that?
Well, under normal circumstances, he would order a new election. In the cases that I've been involved in, which are legislative races or a county office or something like that, the normal cure for an election that's set aside is to hold a new election. That was a real conundrum in this case, because let's just assume that President Trump's lawsuit had been heard in a timely manner. And let's assume that they called me in to testify about these systemic irregularities. And
You froze again.
35,000 witnesses in and out of a courtroom in an elections case that by law is supposed to be held in an expedited manner. It would take years. You can't do it. So that means that these issues cannot be measured in the same discrete manner as paradigm number one. So in my mind, it would have had to have been an argument for systemic irregularities. So let's assume that Trump's case had been heard and evidence was presented of these systemic irregularities, and the judge had set the election aside. That possibility is what got everybody talking about what happens next if that happens.
Yeah.
And that's where the whole alternate elector situation came up, because
I wanted you to talk about this.
Well, the thinking was that if a judge were to set aside Georgia's presidential election due to systemic irregularities, then the job would fall to the legislature of coming up with our electors.
Right.
And so I think that's the root cause of line of thinking. Now, I wasn't involved with any of that kind of stuff, but I can tell you that's where the issue stems from, because there would not have physically been time to hold another election in Georgia to cure this issue.
Right.
It really would have created a problem that's, as far as I'm aware, unprecedented.
Especially since you had that runoff that was coming up not long after the election.
Yeah, and
it would have collided with it.
Yeah, that was a mess too. And then there would have been all kind of lawsuits. There would have been all kinds of issues here. The issues that Ryan Germany brought up probably would have had to have been litigated, because I strongly believe in the position that he took. It's nonsense as far as I'm concerned, but I think most Democrat lawyers anyway would agree with him.
Yeah. How about, can you get into things like the consent decree that Raffensperger's office was in, or can you talk about how a lot of people are saying that when Raffensperger's office, when he leaked the audio of that phone call with President Trump and he leaked it to the media, that he only sent the part. He acted like a fake news media, where he edited out the lead in to what he actually sent, where Trump was actually reading down your data analysis to Raffensperger's people. But what he leaked out made it sound like he was demanding that the Secretary of State of Georgia find illegal votes for him, and how that subsequently led to the RICO charges. So if you could break that all down for us.
This argument is maddening to me, because it's obvious to me what President Trump was saying. He's saying, we believe there was way more than 11,779 unlawful votes that were cast, but go find me at least that many out of this, because he was literally.
When you say out of this, you mean out of all the things that he just read?
Yeah, he had
illegal votes.
He had thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of unlawful votes that he wanted investigated. And he was basically saying, out of all of these illegal votes that we're putting on the table here, go find me 11,779. That's exactly the argument that he was making. And I think it's a reasonable demand to ask of the Secretary of State. And the thing is, Raffensperger, he has admitted that these residency issues occur time and time again, and he did in that phone call. And if you notice, the Trump attorneys kept asking him, okay, well, what's your number? They would never give one. Right. They would just say Trump's number's wrong.
Right. They didn't want to lock themselves in.
And so when I put the evidence on the table and I said, here's evidence of 35,000, sure, some of these might have been, a long-term temporary change of address that was filed as a permanent change, but certainly not all of them, have a legitimate investigation. And that's what they agreed to open.
Right.
But what they did shortly after opening that investigation and getting a look at that data, I think they realized, well, we really can't dispute the data very easily. And we certainly can't agree that President Trump was right in that phone call. So instead, they decided to start disputing the law itself. That was the only out they had. They had painted themselves into such a corner that the only way out of it was to start taking the exact opposite position that every Secretary of State in modern history has taken. And the position that was on their own website the first 2 years that Brad was in office.
Yeah, before they removed it. Yeah. Talk about, if you can, how the consent decree, because a lot of people heard about it, but they don't know what it was. And my take on it, I'll begin, is that the Secretary of State's office, Brad Raffensperger's office, violated election laws by changing election laws, and he's in the executive branch, and he's not allowed to do that. But get into the reasons why he went along with Stacy Abrams' requests for that, and what the consent decree was all about. Where do you hear this, folks?
Well, he makes the argument that he strengthened voter ID.
Oh, okay.
But if you think about it, every time a poll worker came to a questionable signature that they thought needed to be looked into, they had to convene the little 3-man committee, one Democrat, one Republican, and one, I think, appointed by the board or somebody. I can't remember the exact formula, but they had to get the little committee to get together to adjudicate. I think it's actually called an adjudication committee. And so every time that happened, it would bog down the processing of ballots.
Right.
And so as a practical matter, what wound up happening is, I think a lot of election workers started to just ignore those things because they were overwhelmed with their jobs and trying to get things done. And so I think they started to not question issues that should have been questioned. And one of the terrible precedents that was set in Smith versus Odom, in that particular case, that was the double voting case that came out of Long County. And double voting was the issue that got everybody's attention. But there was also a pretty sizable number of really questionable absentee ballots cast in that election down there. And the trial judge said that even though there had been those violations, those voters should have been allowed to come in and cure those violations. And when the decision was appealed to the Georgia Supreme Court, they upheld the trial court's conclusion. And that basically almost eviscerates the enforcement of the laws regarding absentee ballots. I mean, we had ballots that weren't signed. Oh my gosh, get this. This one guy, when he was asked why his signature and his wife's looked so similar, he admitted that she had filled out his ballot for him because he's blind while they were driving to Walmart. So think about that for a minute. The two of them are driving to Walmart. He's driving, but he says since he's blind, he got his wife to fill out his ballot for him. Okay.
He's a hell of a driver.
That was deemed a lawful ballot. There were ballots that weren't signed. There were all kinds of problems with the absentee ballots, and the court upheld them all. And then the Georgia Supreme Court, maybe without realizing what they were doing, they upheld the prior court's decision. So right now, as far as I'm concerned, under Georgia case law, it's kind of the Wild West when it comes to absentee ballots. And I think that's got a lot of people concerned. I know that some of the members of the state election board are concerned. So we'll, I guess, see what happens with that. But
wasn't the consent decree part of it anyway? from what I understand, Stacey Abrams was running her mouth, which is what she does, and it was getting on Raffensperger's nerves. You know, voter suppression, racism, all that stuff. And while the Georgia government is trying to make voting easier but more secure, she's out there screaming voter suppression, racism, all that. So, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, so what he agreed to, his office agreed to with Stacey Abrams was they were going to change the way that they verified the ballot signatures, whereas the law says that you have to match it up to either a driver's license or the person's registration to vote form. And she wanted it changed to match the ballot signature up to drive by Braille. She wanted to match the signature up to the application for an absentee ballot. In other words, the forger's signature to match. Is that correct? Am I correct in that assumption?
I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to that issue going through this because I was mostly focused on these residency issues. But I think, from my understanding of what happened, that's a pretty accurate summary.
But can you imagine that the Secretary of State's office agreed to allow to break the chain of verification that the law said just to shut her up?
Well, I think this is a huge point. I think everybody needs to understand about vote fraud in general. You hear this narrative from the left all the time. There's little or no.
Right. They always say that.
Can't
There's not enough voter suppression. Yeah.
What happens is the vast majority of it goes undetected. What little of it is detected may or may not be reported to the County Board of Elections, or may not be reported to the Secretary of State's office. And then when they get it, they may or may not report it to the State Election Board. And the State Election Board may or may not refer it to the Attorney General's office. And the Attorney General's office is often where vote fraud cases go to die.
Yeah.
In all the cases that I've been involved in, most of the time it's me identifying people who have committed some sort of violation, whether that be the voter or elections officials. And then when I find those violations, I turn them over to the attorney that's handling the case, and they subpoena these people. They bring them in, they put them on the stand, and they question them under oath about, whatever the violation was. I cannot tell you. Admit on the witness stand to violations of the law, and I have never seen any of them held accountable for what
they just won't be. Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
It's a civil case. When you dispute an election, it's a civil case, so that we're not talking about a criminal case here, but still testimony under oath in a civil case about a violation of the law, and nobody holds them.
Yeah, they don't care. Why they don't
say there's little or no evidence of election fraud. Well, that's like saying, well, I went out deer hunting this morning and I never saw a deer, so deer must not exist. To me, it's as silly as that. It's absurd. It's like saying, well, I've never seen anybody illegally cross the border, so there must not be a problem with illegal immigration.
Right. Now, question. It wasn't just the point. All right, let me slow down. You had turned over your work, which was incredible, how you kept pulling those the data files and matching them up to USPS and whatnot, and you caught them moving from one county to the other. But weren't there other scenarios as well that you found?
Oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah, talk about that a little bit. Guys, let me say this. This goes on in nearly every state, these kinds of issues. Like, for example, and give me a minute here. When I was volunteering, you guys might heard the name Frank Rizzo, and I was volunteering for Frank Rizzo years ago, and we sat in a classroom where he was talking to us, and he explained the spigot system in Philadelphia. And he explained that what they do is they take names of people who died or people who moved out of the state. In other words, people you wouldn't know that voted. They would never know they voted because either they're dead or they moved out of the state. And they would register them in those names Okay. And you talked earlier about the NVRA, the National Voter Registry um, Act. And I believe personally that many nefarious people use that NVRA of 1993 to grab lists of people that they know died and or moved out of the state and register them to vote. I don't want to go off into conspiracy theories here, but Frank Rizzo explained to us that that's what they do. And he said that that's what he's up against. And he knew he was running as a Republican, but he had been a Democrat his entire life. And he goes, that's what we're up against. That's the system. And what we used to see in Philly and elsewhere, because what's his name? James O'Keefe caught an election commissioner in 2016 in New York explaining the spigot system. But so it exists there as well. I suspect it exists a lot of places. So what we would see is school buses pull up outside a voting area, and people would get off the bus. And in Philly, they would a guy would have a stack of index cards, and he'd hand one to each person, and that was who you were to go in there and vote. Literally, that's who you were. They would get back on the bus, go to the next county, and do it all over again. And so I think a lot of that's going on, but I think you also found other things besides what you actually turned over. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, what you're describing there is, when the Secretary of State identifies somebody who's moved, they send them out a letter asking them to verify the move. And if they don't respond, they get put on inactive status. Well, they have to stay on inactive status for 2 more federal election cycles. So it can take years to get them off the rolls. And yes, people can take advantage of that the way you're talking about. But the other issues that we saw were also some major residency issues at commercial mail receiving agencies. And those can be easily identified during caste certification processing, which is a type of special postal data processing.
Right. He means post office boxes.
Yeah. So,
which is illegal in Georgia. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, like at the UPS store, people would register, would rent box 231. But then what they do is when they register to vote, they put down the street address of the UPS store and then say unit 231 or apartment 231.
And it's totally illegal. How many did you find?
Of those on the voter rolls that we identified. And I bet if.
Oh, wow. We really got.
The other thing that we found was episodes where there were dozens or hundreds or even thousands of people.
Yeah, you're breaking up, bro.
These were homeless people that were registered at some charity. And I don't have the first problem in the world with a homeless person having a place to get their mail. But when they register at an area that they don't live in, then we don't know if they're voting in the right districts either. It's the same issue that we have with the commercial mail receiving agencies. You can have a box over near your business. You could live miles away. You may not be anywhere near those voting districts where that commercial mail receiving agency is located.
Right.
So those create issues too. And then, you've got all kinds of bogus addresses out there that don't meet the law, that don't hold those standards. You've got addresses out there that literally say missing address in the field for the street address. I mean, you can't even make this stuff up. It's utterly ridiculous, and nobody seems to take it seriously. Nobody seems to be doing much about it. We elected Brad Rathensberger.
You broke up again.
For office.
There you go.
People that support election integrity were among his biggest supporters, myself included.
It turns out he's the exact opposite, isn't he?
To it, instead of admitting that these issues exist and that we need to do something about them, he threw President Trump right under the bus. He could have cleared this up years ago. He could have come out and said, yes, there were tens of thousands of ballots cast with residency issues in the election. The president had legitimate to our attention, and that in that phone call. We're investigating those issues as we speak. It's a large investigation. It may take some time. Please bear with us, but we will get through it. That's the way he could have handled the situation.
He didn't want to do it.
He threw President Trump right under the bus.
And now he's got RICO statutes against him based on a lot on his not wanting to do the right thing.
If Raffensperger was honest about it, he could hold an open and transparent investigation into those issues, and then he could issue a statement that would basically exonerate President Trump on these bogus issues, because that's what they are. The concerns that the Trump attorneys and the president had over these issues was very legitimate. But of course, he's being portrayed as an election denier.
Right. He just wants to get it right. And I mean, think about how you feel. You know, you do really well in the election, and then overnight, like you go to bed, you're winning. They say they're going to stop counting till the morning, and then overnight, suddenly Joe Biden's ahead. How does that happen when you're not counting? Right? You know. Then we had the famous suitcase issue that everybody saw. You didn't really see that, did you? Then we had the flooding, which was a toilet that that you had to shake the handle. I mean, it was crazy down there what was going on. Not as bad as, at least you guys didn't have like Detroit, like they were putting up all those pages on the window so the observers couldn't see. I guess that'll come in 2024. For goodness sake. Crazy stuff, man.
I think our internet's acting up on us, Rich. We might ought to start winding this up, don't you think?
Yeah. You've been breaking up like every 3 minutes or so.
I hope it's washable.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, man. You got anything else you want to say that we didn't cover?
I can't think of anything we didn't cover.
Yeah, I think we did a pretty good job at that. So in the end, Trump is being charged by who I consider a rogue progressive district attorney in Fannie Willis. And it's based on the things that Brad Raffensperger let go out there because he didn't correct the record, if you will. Stacy Abrams Fair Fight attacked you and True the Vote, and you guys just won that case. Congrats, by the way. That was a big win for you guys and a big loss for Mark Elias. So, all right, man. I really appreciate you being here and spending time with us. I hope everybody learned something from this. And if more comes up in the future, I hope to bring you back.
That sounds good. You're cutting out kind of bad over here, Rich. So I'll just thank you and say goodbye.
All right, brother. Have a good one. All right, guys. Have a good day. Thank you, people. See you.